I spent the summer at my straight best friend's family ranch. Everything changed. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss a new upload. Every subscription helps us bring more touching, emotional, and unforgettable stories to life. Thank you for supporting our channel. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy today's story. Sometimes the place you run to is the place that quietly changes who you are forever. I kept repeating that sentence to myself somewhere between mile marker 146 and the endless stretch of Montana highway that seemed determined to swallow every anxious thought I'd been carrying since graduation. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been sitting in a polished conference room in Chicago, convinced I was about to land the architecture job I'd dreamed about since freshman year. 10 minutes later, I was walking back to my apartment with a polite rejection email, a cardboard box full of portfolio sketches, and absolutely no idea what came next. When my best friend, Noah, called and insisted I spend the summer at his family's ranch instead of hiding in my apartment eating frozen pizza and pretending everything was fine, I laughed at first. Me? On a ranch? The closest I'd ever come to farm life was buying organic eggs at a weekend farmer's market. But after enough sleepless nights staring at the ceiling and wondering if I'd somehow wasted 4 years chasing the wrong future, the idea of disappearing into the middle of nowhere sounded less ridiculous than staying exactly where I was. By the time my rental SUV rolled beneath the weathered wooden sign that read Mercer Ranch, my phone had already lost its signal, my city shoes were coated in dust, and the air smelled so clean it almost felt unfamiliar. Mountains stretched across the horizon like they had all the time in the world. Wind pushed through endless fields of golden grass, carrying the distant sound of horses and the rhythmic creak of an old windmill. Everything looked slower here, calmer, as if the world had quietly agreed to stop rushing for a while. Noah came sprinting out of the main house before I'd even shut off the engine, pulling me into a hug so hard I nearly dropped my duffel bag. He looked exactly the same as college, sunburned nose, unstoppable grin, and enough energy to power a small town. We laughed about the drive, about my embarrassingly overpacked suitcase, about how I was probably going to lose a fight with the first chicken that looked at me funny. For the first time in weeks, my shoulders actually relaxed. Then I heard heavy footsteps crossing the gravel behind me. Noah turned first. "Perfect timing," he said. "Lucas, meet my brother." I looked up. Wyatt Mercer stood a few yards away, one hand resting on the fence beside him. He wasn't smiling, but he didn't seem unfriendly either. He looked like someone who spent more time outside than indoors, with sun-faded brown hair, steady blue eyes, worn work boots, and the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly where he belonged. There wasn't anything dramatic about the moment. No music, no lightning, just a simple handshake beneath a bright Montana sky. "Good drive?" he asked. His voice was calm, low, and effortless. "Long one," I admitted, trying not to notice how strangely nervous I suddenly felt. He nodded once. "You'll sleep well tonight, then." It should have been an ordinary conversation, just two strangers exchanging polite words. But as Wyatt picked up my heavier suitcase before I could protest and started walking toward the house without making a big deal out of it, I found myself watching him longer than necessary. I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way he seemed completely comfortable without trying to impress anyone. Or maybe, though I wouldn't admit it until much later, something inside me had already begun changing before I even realized the summer had truly begun. The next morning, I discovered two things almost immediately. First, Montana sunlight had absolutely no respect for anyone hoping to sleep past 6:30 in the morning. Second, ranch life had even less respect for someone who had spent the last 4 years surviving on coffee, blueprints, and late-night design projects. I stumbled into the kitchen wearing a borrowed sweatshirt, still trying to wake up, only to find Noah already halfway through breakfast while Wyatt stood at the counter pouring fresh coffee into a chipped ceramic mug. The smell of bacon, homemade biscuits, and strong black coffee filled the room. It was comforting in a way I had almost forgotten existed. "Morning, city boy," Noah grinned. "You have exactly 15 minutes before Wyatt puts you to work." I laughed, assuming he was joking. Wyatt glanced toward me without looking amused. 14 now. I blinked. "You are serious." "Very." Somehow that single word made Noah laugh even harder. Less than half an hour later, I was standing in the middle of an open pasture wondering how grass could possibly stretch that far without reaching an ending. Wyatt handed me a pair of leather gloves. "We are repairing fencing today." I have never repaired a fence in my life. I figured. Was it that obvious? He looked at my spotless boots. Very. I wanted to come back with something clever, but instead I followed him through the field, trying not to trip over uneven ground every 30 seconds. The fence itself looked simple enough until I actually attempted to help. Within 5 minutes, I managed to tangle a roll of wire around my boot, nearly dropped the toolbox into the mud, and somehow put one glove on inside out without realizing it. Noah laughed so hard he had to lean against a fence post to catch his breath. I expected Wyatt to join him. Instead, he quietly crouched beside me, untangled the wire without saying a word, flipped the glove the right way, and handed it back like none of it deserved embarrassment. "Everybody starts somewhere," he said simply. There was no sarcasm, no pity, just a fact. That surprised me more than anything. The morning settled into an easy rhythm after that. Wyatt showed me how to stretch fencing wire without straining it, how to spot weak posts before they leaned, and why every shortcut usually created twice as much work later. He never explained things like I was incapable. He explained them like he genuinely expected I could learn. That strange confidence slowly became contagious. By lunchtime, my shoulders ached, my hands were sore, and I had developed a deep respect for anyone who did physical work every single day. We ate sandwiches beneath the shade of an enormous cottonwood tree while horses grazed quietly nearby. Wind drifted across the pasture carrying the scent of pine and fresh hay. Nobody felt pressured to fill every silence. Back home, silence usually meant awkwardness. Here it somehow meant peace. Later that afternoon, Wyatt asked me to help carry feed into one of the barns. I confidently grabbed the wrong bags, nearly walked into the wrong storage room, and accidentally startled 3 curious goats that scattered in every direction while Noah doubled over laughing again. I groaned, covering my face. I am becoming the entertainment, aren't I? Wyatt's lips twitched into the smallest smile I had seen from him. A little. Glad somebody is enjoying this. He looked at me for a second before answering. "You will get better." For reasons I could not explain, hearing him say those 4 words mattered far more than it should have. It was not just about ranch work anymore. Somehow it felt like he was talking about everything I thought I had failed at before I ever arrived here. By the end of the first week, I had stopped checking my phone every 15 minutes. There was barely any signal on the ranch anyway, but somewhere along the way I realized I did not miss it nearly as much as I thought I would. My mornings started with the smell of coffee instead of traffic. My evenings ended beneath a sky crowded with more stars than I had ever seen back in Chicago. Every day followed a familiar rhythm, and somehow that rhythm was beginning to quiet the constant noise inside my head. Wyatt remained exactly who he had been on the first day. He spoke when there was something worth saying, worked harder than anyone else on the ranch, and somehow noticed every little thing before anyone else did. He always knew when a horse was limping before it became obvious. He could predict the weather by watching the clouds for less than a minute. He remembered which fence post needed replacing without writing anything down. Watching him work felt strangely similar to watching a master architect study blueprints. Everything had purpose. Everything belonged somewhere. One afternoon, Noah drove into town to pick up supplies, leaving Wyatt and me to check several water troughs scattered across the north pasture. The sun hung high above us, warming everything it touched, while a steady breeze rolled across the open fields. We had barely finished the second trough when dark clouds began gathering over the mountains much faster than either of us expected. "We should head for the line shack," Wyatt said, glancing toward the horizon. "Storm is moving quicker than forecast." We reached the small wooden shelter just as heavy rain began drumming against the tin roof. The sudden downpour blurred the entire valley into shades of gray and silver. Thunder rumbled somewhere far away, low enough to feel through the wooden floorboards. Inside the little cabin, there was only a bench, an old lantern, and the comforting smell of aged pine. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. We simply listened to the rain. It sounded like the whole world had decided to slow down at once. I finally broke the silence. I never told anyone how much that interview messed me up. Wyatt leaned back against the wall, waiting instead of interrupting. I kept acting like it was just another job application. It was not. I built my entire future around that one opportunity. When they said no, I started wondering if maybe they saw something in me that I had been refusing to see myself. My laugh came out quieter than I intended. Funny how one email can make you question 4 years of your life. Wyatt looked out through the rain before answering. I know that feeling. I turned toward him. He rested his forearms on his knees, staring at the muddy ground outside. I was accepted into an agricultural engineering program after high school. I wanted to design irrigation systems out west. I had everything ready. He smiled, but it carried more memory than happiness. Then my father got sick. Somebody had to stay. The ranch came first. I blinked. You never went. He slowly shook his head. No. Do you regret it? He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. Finally he said, some days. Other days I walk outside before sunrise, hear the horses, watch this land wake up, and I remember why I stayed. The rain softened until it became little more than a gentle whisper against the roof. I realized we had just shared more about ourselves in 20 minutes than some people shared after years of friendship. Neither confession solved anything. My future was still uncertain. His sacrifices had not disappeared. But somehow the weight felt lighter simply because someone else understood what it felt like to quietly let go of the life you once imagined. The days began slipping past so quietly that I stopped counting them. Morning chores no longer felt like obstacles designed to embarrass me. I could finally saddle a horse without fumbling every buckle twice, stack hay bales without throwing my back into open rebellion, and even tell the difference between confidence and overconfidence after nearly walking into a muddy creek because I insisted I knew a shortcut. Noah laughed until he had tears in his eyes, and for the first time I laughed just as hard. Somehow failing here never felt permanent. It simply became another story waiting to be told over dinner. Wyatt noticed the difference before I did. One afternoon, he tossed me a coil of rope from the back of the truck. You tie the gate today. I caught it awkwardly. You trust me with that? You have earned it. For simple words. They should not have meant much. Yet I carried them around for the rest of the day like they weighed far more than the rope in my hands. Back in Chicago, compliments usually arrived attached to deadlines or expectations. Here they appeared quietly, without ceremony, and somehow felt more honest because of it. As the second week rolled on, I found myself looking for Wyatt without realizing I was doing it. If he was repairing a tractor near the equipment shed, I somehow ended up needing something from that direction. If he was checking fences along the east pasture, I volunteered before Noah could even ask. I kept inventing perfectly reasonable explanations that became less convincing every single day. It was ridiculous. He was simply kind, patient, easy to trust. That was all. At least that was what I kept telling myself every night before falling asleep. One evening, after finishing the last of the feeding, we climbed onto the old wooden fence overlooking the western pasture while the horses wandered through tall grass glowing beneath the setting sun. The sky shifted from bright blue into deep shades of orange, pink, and purple that looked almost unreal. Neither of us reached for our phones. Neither of us seemed interested in filling the silence. A hawk drifted overhead, circling lazily on the warm air currents. You are thinking again, Wyatt said without looking at me. I smiled. Am I that obvious? Only when you stare at the horizon like it owes you answers. I laughed softly. Maybe it does. He rested his elbows on the top rail of the fence. Sometimes answers take longer than people want. I looked at him. Do you always talk like somebody who secretly writes fortune cookies? A quiet chuckle escaped him, surprising both of us. It was the first time I had heard him laugh without holding it back, and somehow the sound fit the evening perfectly. Do not tell Noah, he said. I have a reputation. Your secret is safe. The breeze lifted loose strands of his sun-faded hair, and for a brief moment our eyes met without either of us looking away. There was nothing dramatic about it. No sudden confession. No impossible coincidence. Just a few seconds that somehow lasted much longer than they should have. My heartbeat stumbled for reasons I could not explain logically. I looked away first, pretending to admire the sunset, while silently wondering when simple conversations had started becoming the best part of my day. Walking back toward the house beneath the first scattered stars, our shoulders brushed once by accident along the narrow path. Neither of us apologized. Neither of us stepped farther away. It was only the lightest touch, gone almost as quickly as it happened, but the warmth of that fleeting moment stayed with me long after the Montana night settled over the ranch. The following morning began like every other, with cool air drifting through the open kitchen window, and Noah trying to convince everyone that his pancakes deserved some kind of national award. Wyatt rolled his eyes without looking up from his coffee. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled orange juice across the table. For a brief moment, everything felt wonderfully ordinary, and I caught myself wishing mornings could stay exactly like this forever. That quiet feeling lasted until early afternoon. Noah had driven into town to pick up veterinary supplies, leaving Wyatt and me to organize equipment inside one of the older storage barns. Sunlight filtered through narrow wooden slats, filling the dusty air with glowing ribbons of gold. I climbed a ladder to move several empty boxes from an upper shelf when a weathered folder slid loose and landed near my boots. It had probably been sitting there for years. I bent down to return it, but a folded property survey slipped onto the floor beside a stack of legal papers. Across the top, bold letters immediately caught my attention. Northern Pasture Land Transfer Agreement. I froze. The highlighted acreage matched the beautiful stretch of rolling hills where we had watched the sunset only a few nights earlier. There were signatures, financial figures, closing dates. My stomach tightened. Wyatt stepped into the aisle carrying another toolbox. His expression changed the instant he saw the papers in my hands. He walked over calmly and reached for them. "Those are private." I handed them back, trying to sound casual even though my thoughts were racing. "You are selling part of the ranch?" He hesitated just long enough to make my imagination fill every empty space. "It is complicated." I frowned. Complicated usually means yes. He carefully slid the documents back into the folder. "Lucas, Noah has spent this entire summer talking about keeping this place in the family. Your father built this ranch. You told me this land mattered." My voice grew sharper before I realized it. "Now you are selling it." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "You do not know the full situation." "Then explain it." Silence settled between us, heavy enough to make the entire barn feel smaller. Wyatt looked toward the open doorway instead. The ranch felt different after that afternoon, although nothing around us had actually changed. The horses still wandered through the pastures with quiet patience. The wind still carried the scent of pine and fresh-cut hay across the hills. Every sunrise painted the mountains in warm shades of gold. Yet somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, the easy rhythm that had settled between Wyatt and me disappeared. We spoke only when necessary. If he needed another fence post, I handed it over. If I asked where a tool belonged, he answered politely. Every conversation became shorter than the one before. Noah noticed it almost immediately. During dinner, he glanced back and forth between us several times before finally setting down his fork. "Did you two secretly declare war while I was buying cattle feed?" I forced a smile. "Everything is fine." Wyatt gave the exact same answer. "Everything is fine." Noah frowned. "That is how I know nothing is fine." Neither of us laughed. 2 days later, Noah asked me to help organize receipts inside the ranch office while he finished loading supplies into the truck. Filing papers sounded like a welcome break from pretending everything was normal. I sorted invoices into neat stacks until an envelope slipped from the corner of an old ledger. Across the front was the logo of a regional medical center. I reached for it without thinking, intending to place it back where it belonged, but several billing statements slid halfway out. The total made my stomach tighten. It was more money than I had ever seen attached to a single medical account. Before I could look away, Noah stepped through the doorway carrying another box. He followed my gaze to the envelope and quietly closed the office door behind him. "You found it," he said. I looked up. "What happened?" Noah rested both hands on the desk and let out a slow breath. "Dad's treatment started almost a year ago. Insurance covered part of it, but not enough. Wyatt refused to tell anyone outside the family." My chest felt strangely hollow. "The land." Noah nodded once. "The northern pasture was the only piece valuable enough to cover the bills without risking the entire ranch. Wyatt spent months trying to find another solution. Every word felt heavier than the last. Why did he not tell me?" Noah gave me a tired smile. "Because he does not like people carrying burdens that belong to him. He thinks protecting everyone else is somehow his full-time job." I remembered standing in the barn accusing Wyatt of giving up on the ranch. I remembered the disappointment in my own voice. I remembered the way he simply accepted every unfair word without defending himself. Shame settled over me with surprising force. That evening, I found Wyatt repairing an old section of fence near the western pasture. The sun was beginning to sink behind the hills, throwing long shadows across the field. He did not notice me at first. I watched him straighten another weathered post with the same quiet determination he seemed to bring to everything. Suddenly, I understood that he had never been letting the ranch go. He had been holding it together the only way he knew how. I took one step forward before stopping again. The apology waiting inside me felt too small for everything I needed to say. At that exact moment, Wyatt lifted another bundle of paperwork from the back of his truck. A strong gust of wind swept across the pasture, scattering pages into the air like a flock of startled birds. Without thinking, both of us ran after them across the open field. We reached the last page at exactly the same time. Our hands brushed as we picked it up together. Neither of us spoke, but for the first time in days, the silence no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a door that had quietly begun to open. The next morning, I found Wyatt exactly where I expected, already working before the sun had fully cleared the mountains. Dew still clung to the grass, turning every step into a trail of tiny diamonds beneath my boots. He looked up as I approached, his expression calm but unreadable. I opened my mouth, rehearsing a dozen different apologies that had sounded convincing 5 minutes earlier. None of them survived the walk across the pasture. I was wrong, I finally said. About all of it. He rested both hands on the wooden handle of his shovel, but did not interrupt. Noah told me everything. The breeze stirred between us, carrying the distant sound of horses grazing beyond the fence line. I lowered my eyes for a moment. I accused you of giving up when you were the one carrying everyone else. Wyatt was quiet long enough that I almost believed he would walk away. Instead, he let out a slow breath. You reacted with the information you had. That does not make it fair. A faint smile appeared, tired but genuine. No, it does not. Relief settled over me so suddenly that I almost laughed. We returned to work side by side without saying much else, but the silence had changed again. It no longer felt careful. It felt familiar. Later that afternoon, I wandered through the ranch with fresh eyes, noticing things I had overlooked before. The old red barn had beautiful timber framing that could easily become an event space. The unused meadow near the creek offered incredible views of the mountains. Empty cabins tucked beneath the pine trees could become guest lodging with thoughtful renovations. Every corner of the property held possibilities that had nothing to do with selling more land. By dinner, I had filled an entire sketchbook with rough drawings. Noah flipped through the pages, eyebrows climbing higher with every design. You came here to escape architecture, he said. Looks like architecture followed you anyway. I smiled. Maybe I was just looking at it the wrong way before. Wyatt studied one sketch showing a renovated horse barn surrounded by picnic tables, walking trails, and outdoor gathering spaces. People would actually come for something like this? Families would, I answered. Photographers, weekend travelers, school groups. You already have the landscape. You already have the story. You only need a better way to invite people to experience it. For the first time since I had arrived, I watched genuine hope replace some of the constant worry in Wyatt's eyes. Over the following days, we worked together from sunrise until long after sunset. I measured buildings while Wyatt explained decades of ranch history. He pointed out practical details I never would have considered. I suggested ways to preserve the character of the property while creating new sources of income. Instead of solving problems separately, we started finishing each other's ideas. One evening, while reviewing sketches across the hood of Wyatt's pickup truck, a familiar voice interrupted us. Mr. Harrison, a neighboring ranch owner, had stopped by after hearing rumors that Mercer Ranch might sell more acreage. Wyatt politely explained that nothing else was available. After the man drove away, I looked at Wyatt. You really believe this can work now, do not you? He looked toward the barns, then across the fields glowing beneath the setting sun. For the first time in a long while, he said softly, I do. His eyes met mine, steady and warm, and something unspoken passed between us with all the quiet certainty of the Montana evening. Neither of us named it. Neither of us needed to. Some feelings arrive loudly. The important ones sometimes arrive as quietly as home. The presentation came together faster than any project I had ever worked on. Every morning, Wyatt and I walked the property with measuring tape, notebooks, and cups of coffee that never seemed to stay hot for long. We marked future walking trails through the cottonwoods, imagined family picnic areas beside the creek, and discussed restoring the oldest barn instead of replacing it. The more we planned, the more I realized the ranch had never needed to become something different. It simply needed people to see what had been there all along. Noah joked that we had started speaking our own language, one filled with sketches, fence lines, visitor cabins, and impossible ideas that somehow became realistic after enough conversations around the kitchen table. Even Wyatt, who had always been cautious about change, started pointing toward empty spaces and saying things like, "What if families could watch the sunrise from here?" Or would children enjoy helping feed the horses? Every new question sounded a little more hopeful than the last. A week later, we presented the proposal to a small group of local business owners, tourism representatives, and neighbors who had supported the ranch for years. I stood in front of my drawings with nervous hands while Wyatt explained the history behind every building and every pasture. By the time we finished, the room had fallen completely silent. For one terrifying second, I thought we had failed. Then an older woman from the county tourism board smiled. "You are not trying to replace the ranch," she said. "You are inviting people to experience it." One by one, others began nodding. Several local businesses offered partnerships. A nearby outdoor equipment company expressed interest in sponsoring seasonal events. Nothing was finalized that afternoon, but for the first time the future felt larger than the financial problems chasing it. Driving back to the ranch, Noah rolled down every truck window and celebrated loudly enough to scare half the birds from a nearby fence line. Wyatt simply smiled toward the windshield, and somehow that quiet smile meant even more than Noah's excitement. 2 days later, while helping organize paperwork inside the office, my phone vibrated with a number I almost ignored. "Chicago." My heartbeat immediately changed. I stepped outside before answering. The voice on the other end belonged to the architecture firm that had rejected me weeks earlier. A senior designer explained that another position had unexpectedly opened after reviewing my portfolio again. They wanted me in Chicago within 10 days if I was still interested. I thanked them, promised to call back soon, and ended the conversation without moving. The mountains stood exactly where they always had. Horses grazed peacefully beyond the fence. Somewhere inside the barn, I could hear Noah laughing about something completely unrelated to life-changing phone calls. Everything around me remained perfectly ordinary, while my future quietly split into two different directions. That evening, I found Wyatt repairing a loose gate near the entrance road. He noticed my expression before I spoke. Something happened. It was not a question. I nodded. The firm called. They offered me the job. He stood very still for a moment before setting his tools aside. "Congratulations, Lucas." His smile was sincere, but I could see the effort it took to hold it there. I looked down at the dusty ground between us. I thought hearing those words would make the decision easy. Wyatt studied the fading sunset stretching across the valley. "Sometimes the dream you chased is not the one waiting for you anymore." Neither of us said anything after that. We simply stood beside the old wooden gate as evening settled gently over the ranch, both understanding that some crossroads arrive without warning and that choosing a future is often much harder than imagining one. The next morning, I called the architecture firm before anyone else was awake. I stood alone on the porch, watching the first light spill across the pastures while the mountains slowly emerged from the darkness. The recruiter sounded genuinely pleased to hear from me. She explained the position again, the benefits, the projects, the future I had wanted for so many years. When she finally asked whether I accepted the offer, I closed my eyes for a moment and smiled. "I am honored," I said quietly. "But I have to say no." After hanging up, I expected panic, regret, doubt. Instead, I felt something I had not experienced in months. Peace. A few hours later, I found Wyatt repairing the weathered sign at the entrance to the ranch. He looked up as I approached, setting his hammer aside. "You made your decision?" I nodded. "I did." He searched my face for a long second. "Chicago?" I shook my head. "No." The breeze lifted the edge of one of my rolled sketches as I handed it to him. He slowly opened the drawing. It was not another renovation plan. It showed a small cottage built on an empty rise overlooking the western pasture, with wide front windows facing the sunset and a wraparound porch that blended naturally into the landscape. Wyatt looked from the drawing back to me. "What is this?" "Home," I answered. He stared at the paper again, his expression softening with quiet disbelief. "You are serious." "I have never been more serious about anything." Before he could respond, Noah came jogging across the yard waving a thick envelope over his head. "You two are going to want to see this." Inside were the official partnership agreements from the tourism board and the local businesses that had attended our presentation. Funding had been approved for the first phase of the ranch project. Noah laughed loud enough to echo across the valley before wrapping both of us into an awkward hug that none of us managed to escape. Work began almost immediately. The old barn slowly transformed without losing its history. Walking paths wound naturally through the fields. Families started booking weekend visits before construction had even finished. Children laughed while feeding horses. Photographers arrived at sunrise to capture the mountain views. The ranch did not become famous overnight, but it became something even better. It became alive in a new way while honoring everything it had always been. 3 months later, I stood beside the completed cottage as the evening sun painted the hills in shades of gold and amber. Wyatt walked toward me carrying 2 mugs of coffee, just as he had so many mornings before. He stopped beside me, looking out across the familiar landscape. "You really stayed," he said softly. I smiled. "I told you this place changed me." He was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "It was never just the ranch." My heart understood what he meant long before my mind found the words. I turned toward him. "No," I admitted. "It was never just the ranch." His smile appeared slowly, the kind that reached his eyes first. He reached for my hand with quiet certainty, giving me every chance to step away if I wanted to. I did not. Our fingers fit together as naturally as if they had always belonged there. No audience. No grand speech. Just 2 people standing beneath a Montana sunset, surrounded by the life they had helped rebuild together. As the wind moved gently through the tall grass and the horses wandered peacefully across the pasture below, I realized success had never been about finding the perfect job or chasing the perfect future. Sometimes success looked like choosing the place where your heart finally felt at home, and choosing the person who made that home complete.